The rotors pounded the frozen air as the helicopter banked low over the Panjshir Valley. Snow crusted the peaks, gunfire sparked from the ridgelines, and tracers tore into the night. Soldiers of the 40th Army gripped their rifles tight as the Mi-24 gunship opened fire with rockets, the blast shaking stone from the cliffs. Somewhere below, Mujahideen fighters melted into caves and ravines, invisible until the flash of an RPG arced upward. One chopper went down trailing fire, smashing against a slope in seconds. It was 1980, less than a year after the Soviets crossed the border into Afghanistan. For Moscow, it was supposed to be a short intervention. Instead, it became a decade-long war that killed over 1 million Afghans, tens of thousands of Soviet troops, and drained the power of an empire already beginning to crack. The war began in December 1979. Afghanistan was already in turmoil. In 1978, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, a Marxist-Leninist group, seized power in what became known as the Sour Revolution. The new government under Nur Muhammad Taraki and then Hafizullah Amin launched land reforms, secularized schools, and tried to crush tribal and religious leaders who opposed them. Resistance spread fast, villages erupted in rebellion, and by late 1979, the Afghan state teetered on collapse. The Soviet Union, fearing the loss of a communist ally and worried about Islamist influence spilling toward Central Asia, decided to act. On December 24, 1979, armored columns rolled across the Amu Darya River while airborne troops descended on Kabul. Within days, President Amin was dead, killed in a storming of the Tajbeg Palace, and Babrak Karmal was installed as Moscow's man in charge. What Moscow expected to be a quick stabilization turned into a nightmare. Afghanistan's geography swallowed armies whole. Villages clung to valleys, mountains hid passes, and loyalty shifted with kinship and tribe. The Mujahideen, drawn from tribal militias and Islamist networks, took to guerrilla war. They struck convoys, mined roads, and used the terrain to bleed the Soviets. The 40th Army swelled to over 100,000 troops, backed by tanks, helicopters, and jets, but for every valley they cleared, fighters slipped back once the columns withdrew. Brutality followed frustration. Soviet bombers carpeted villages suspected of harboring resistance. Helicopters strafed wedding parties mistaken for gatherings of fighters. Mines shaped like toys were dropped to maim children and terrorize families into leaving fertile ground. By the mid-1980s, the war had hardened into a stalemate. The Mujahideen were fractured, but foreign support began to bind them together. Pakistan's intelligence service funneled weapons and training across the border. Saudi Arabia sent money, framing the fight as a holy war. The United States saw a chance to bleed its Cold War rival and poured billions of dollars into Operation Cyclone, one of the largest covert programs in CIA history. At first, the weapons were old rifles and light arms, but soon advanced gear arrived: mortars, radios, and eventually, the weapon that tilted the skies: the American-made FIM-92 Stinger missile. By 1986, Soviet helicopters that once dominated the valleys were being shot down in flames. Inside the Soviet Union, the cost mounted. Official reports spoke of limited contingents and international duty, but coffins draped in red flags returned to towns across Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia. Families were told their sons had died heroically, but whispers spread of units ambushed, soldiers deserting, and drug abuse rampant in the barracks. Medical staff spoke of wounds worse than World War II, burns from fuel fires, shredded limbs from mines. By the end, nearly 15,000 Soviet troops were dead, with more than 50,000 wounded. The psychological toll ran deeper, as veterans returned scarred and ignored by a society that wanted to forget the war. On the Afghan side, The suffering was almost incalculable. Villages burned, crops destroyed. An estimated 1 million Afghans were killed, many more wounded. 5 million fled as refugees, pouring into camps in Pakistan and Iran. Children grew up with Kalashnikovs, as common as bread. Roads became graveyards of twisted armor. The countryside turned into a patchwork of warlords, each loyal to their own network, but united in hatred of the occupier. The Soviets controlled the cities by day, but the countryside belonged to the Mujahideen by night. Moscow tried to adapt. In 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to leadership in the Kremlin, facing economic stagnation at home and pressure abroad. He called Afghanistan a bleeding wound and began searching for a way out. Soviet forces shifted tactics, relying more on Afghan government troops under President Najibullah, a former secret police chief. The Soviets poured resources into building up the Afghan army and secret police, the KHAD, trying to create a state that could stand once their own troops left. But trust was thin and defections were constant. By then, the Mujahideen had momentum, emboldened by international backing and the symbolism of confronting a superpower. Negotiations crept forward. The United Nations sponsored talks in Geneva, while on the ground, fighting continued with no mercy. In April 1988, accords were signed that set a timetable for withdrawal. For the Soviet soldier in the field, it meant surviving one last year. Convoys began rolling north. Helicopters lifted off from Kandahar and Jalalabad, heavy with equipment. Mines and booby traps lined every road. The Mujahideen struck at retreating columns, determined to show they had driven the Red Army out by force. In Moscow, state television presented it as an honorable conclusion to a noble duty. On February 15, 1989, General Boris Gromov walked across the Friendship Bridge into Uzbekistan, the last Soviet commander to leave. Cameras caught the image. The war was over for the USSR. Its consequences would echo for decades. The Afghan government under Najibullah held out for 3 more years, propped up by Soviet money and weapons, before collapsing in 1992. The Mujahideen seized Kabul, then fell into civil war among themselves. Out of the chaos, the Taliban rose by the mid-1990s. In the training camps of the 1980s, a generation of Arab volunteers had come to fight the Soviets. Among them was a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden. The seeds of modern jihad had been planted in the mountains where Soviet helicopters once burned. For Russia, the war left an army demoralized, an economy drained, and a people distrustful of their leaders' promises. For Afghanistan, it meant another generation growing up with war as the only constant. The Soviet war in Afghanistan lasted 9 years, 1 month, and 19 days. It ended not with victory, but with withdrawal under pressure, its costs far beyond what Moscow had planned. An empire already weakening under its own weight, cracked further under the strain. For the Afghan people, the war was only one chapter in a cycle of violence that would continue long after the last Soviet tank crossed the border. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.